national presidential election is still officially unofficial. So I think we're all quite aware of the news frame on that. It's a great segue, speaking of ethics, to talk about what we're going to talk about today. The primary goal today is to make you think, whether you're serving as a panelist or a participant. What we want to do is we want to make you think. We want to make you think about your ethical foundation and how strong it is, or perhaps could it be stronger? We want you to reflect and to contemplate and to process all of these new things in post-COVID world as they relate to ethics and the practice of public relations. Specifically, we're going to talk about three realities. There's truth-telling and there's ethics. Are there any non-negotiable ethics in your world, in your view, that are completely sacred? And there's doing the right thing, and there's doing the ethical thing. For the purposes of today's event, I wanted to have an agreed upon definition of ethics. And interestingly enough, there are probably almost as many definitions of ethics as there are of public relations. So the definition, the fact that there's not just a standard definition, kind of sets us up for this is not as easy as one might think. So that in and of itself is a challenge. But for the purposes of today's event, if we could agree on the definition of public relations as ethics are standards of acceptable behavior based on personal values, societal norms, and laws of the land that include key principles such as honesty, openness, loyalty, fairness, and respect to doing the right thing. In studying religions across the globe for the past several years, I've spent a lot of time doing that. And one of the most common themes, if not the most common threads about that, is what we typically call the golden rule. So if nothing else about the definition of ethics, if you're not in agreement with that, if we can just agree on ethics for the purposes of this event, is to treat one another by the golden rule, treat another person as you would like to be treated. That typically crosses all cultural and religious lines. So if we could agree to that, that would be great for today. I'd like to start off with bringing Rod on our panel. And in a nutshell, Rod, if you could just give your background in terms of PRCA and in a nutshell, describe the PRCA's standards, codes of conduct, and charter, specifically their enforceability mechanisms, and how all of that impacted the 2017 Bell Pottinger case, that would be great.
Sure. Well, delighted to be on. This is an evergreen but never more important topic. So delighted to be here. So I've been involved with PRCA for about 25 years, basically my entire career. I'm a PRCA fellow. I was on the board for 10 years. I chaired the Public Affairs Committee in the UK over that period as well. I was a parliamentary witness. I was also part of the Professional Practices Committee for Bell Pottinger. So I've certainly done my time from a PRCA perspective. I was also deputy chair of the Global COVID-19 Communications Task Force. So yes, that's me in a nutshell. In terms of the charter and the codes of conduct, so if you're a PRCA member, then a requirement of all members is to abide by both the professional charter and the codes of conduct. All members are expected to know both the charter and the codes, and a bit like the law, ignorance is not an excuse. So ignorance of their existence and ignorance of the requirement to follow them doesn't get you off the hook. If you think of the professional charter, and all of this is on the PRCA website, think of the charter as, if you like, the overall ethical umbrella, which applies to all public relations and communications professionals in all their activities. By contrast, the specific codes, such as the Public Affairs and Lobbying Code, lay out sector-specific ethical requirements for practitioners in certain disciplines. So the Charter and the codes are enforced through a set of very transparent arbitration and disciplinary procedures. In the first instance, the PRCA always tries to facilitate and mediate between any parties in dispute, whether those those parties are members of the PRCA or not. If it's not possible to mediate, then the board can convene the professional practice committee that I mentioned, which are usually senior practitioners, to review a complaint, engage with both parties through a disciplinary hearing, and advise the board on next steps. So to take the Bell Pottinger case, following a complaint from the Democratic Alliance, which is one of the main opposition parties in South Africa, a committee was convened to look at Bell Pottinger's alleged activities working for the Gupta family in South Africa. The complaint was that they'd allegedly breached 2 clauses of the Charter and 2 clauses of the Public Affairs Code. We had a 6-hour disciplinary hearing with both parties and their legal representatives, and ruled unanimously that, in our view, they were in breach of both clauses on both codes, and that decision was acted upon and upheld by the board, who subsequently expelled Bell Pottinger from membership. You may have seen as well that both the PRCA and the Public Affairs Board have just opened a live investigation in the UK into an agency called Portland, following accusations in the media about potential breaches of the code. And again, I'll share those in a second, so you've got a picture of the sort of stuff that we're talking about. 2 last points before I hand over. The first, and we'll pick on this later on, is that the Charter and the codes are simply a starting point. They're not an end in themselves. Corporately and individually, it's essential to remember that you can't think that just because you've read them and agreed to them that you're in the clear. You're not. They have to be lived and implemented in your day-to-day work. And secondly, while it's obviously essential that every member organization facilitates awareness of the codes and adherence to them, it's down to each and every individual practitioner, each of you, to embed them in the way that you think, the way that you operate. The way I think about this is ethical practice is a bit like you being a canary in the coal mine for yourself, for your employer, and for your clients. So think about the code as a starting point that you should embed and follow every day of your working life, not a dry document that sits on a website or on a shelf. So that's me, Susan.
Yeah, thank you, Rod. Very impressive, very impressive. In fact, Izzy, if we could go to the next slide, it's very clear that PRCA completely exists to raise ethical standards in PR and communications. It holds individual members and group members accountable for their behavior. My point I can't emphasize enough, its entire mission, its sole reason for being is to raise ethical standards in our profession. I mean, that's not only an honorable thing to do, it is a successful thing to do, as we'll talk a little bit later about, and as you mentioned earlier, about the growth of the organization. So they're doing something correctly, and we need to talk about what we can learn from that. Another point back to Rod's mentioning the Bell Pottinger case. When PRCA expelled Bell Pottinger in 2017 for its activities, the government spokesperson in the House of Lords upper house said, the UK has a world-leading system of professional standards and industry-specific codes of conduct, which we encourage British companies to uphold in their operations domestically and overseas. That praise has infiltrated PRCA presence in numerous other countries, as Izzy mentioned earlier, and most recently the Latin Americas and now the North Americas. That's pretty high praise. That's a very, very strong statement. So again, they're doing something correctly. Again, staying on the global front, as recently as last week, the International Communications Consultancy Organization, also called ECO, just released its 2020-21 World PR Report showing results of how ethical the public relations profession is compared among numerous global regions. And we are fortunate to have with us today a member of the ECO board, and that is Mary Beth West. Mary Beth is also the co-chair of the Global Ethics Council, a newly formed entity in recent months, again, talking about raising ethical standards on a global level. And I've asked her to address this latest report, if Mary Beth could chime in on that. Mary Beth?
So sorry. Everybody can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone. And the ECO organization is a consortium of public relations agencies worldwide, and they just released, as part of their annual report out to the industry, their world report, which is in large part an economic forecast and indicator for agencies worldwide to prognosticate a bit about where the industry is going and where new business opportunities exist, really what the state of the industry is for public relations, and really for the industry to have a bit of a meeting of the minds as to where growth, but also where some of the challenges exist within the industry. And one of the questions that they began asking last year, sort of as a first time question, was this issue of where does ethics rank, or where does your region of the company or of the world rank in terms of its level of operating ethically as an industry, wherein those respondents to the survey had the opportunity to rank to what extent the industry is operating on an ethical platform within the confines of its regional sector. So it was very interesting to me that within the report out last year, North America ranked #1 among all of the other regions of the world. And yet this year fell to #2 behind Western Europe. And I found this to be really telling in that we have to ask ourselves what's been going on in the world and what has been happening in the United States, and of course, the North American region also constitutes Canada and Mexico. So it's really looking at the entirety of the North American region, but the United States is sort of a dominant force there. And I tend to point to the fact that in our region, we don't have a compliance driven or an enforced ethics code model for our region of the world. And I think that some of those chickens are coming home to roost, to use a turn of phrase that I guess sometimes we use here in the South, maybe a bit more so than anywhere else. And, I think that there is some of that we're having to have a bit of a reckoning. And one of the other questions that was asked was, what's driving some of that? What are driving some of the ethics challenges for North America? And pressure from clients was one of the issues that some of their survey respondents pointed to. Balancing agency income and growth with considerations around ethical behavior from clients was a second item. And then also consequences for agencies that do not behave ethically was another thing that was pointed to. And the final thing that I'll note here as we kind of go on with this discussion is that there's another organization in the US that I'm a member of, and it's called the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, ECI. And they did a study recently that pointed to the fact that change, with the level of change that is going on in the world, especially with COVID-19 and all of the crises that have been brought to bear to the world stage, the more change that is brought to bear, the more ethics can be brought into question for organizations. So employees that are working in organizations with 4 to 7 significant changes in 12 months are 2 times as likely to say that they observed misconduct than employees that are working in an organization without any significant change going on. So when you think about how much change is happening happening right now in the world, that's something that all of us have to take into consideration, especially as we look ahead to next year. So back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Let's go a bit from a global perspective and spend just a few moments on the U.S. As Rod has mentioned about PRCA, which is based in London, and as Mary Beth has mentioned, ECI, which I believe is based in D.C. Those are entities that are very serious about their codes of conduct because they have an enforceability and accountability mechanisms. The largest trade association for public relations practitioners in the U.S. is the Public Relations Society of America, PRSA. And they have had a code of conduct or code of ethics pretty much since their beginning, and they are 75 plus years old. So they have had for many decades a code of ethics. Initially, it was an enforceable code. And the most recent change to that code was literally 20 years ago, and the powers that be decided that the code was to be aspirational only. So it is a guideline, it is an education tool, it is something to aspire to. Their codes of ethics, including their principles of honesty and fairness and loyalty, and the other principles that we've talked about and we all agreed upon in terms of the defining ethics. And full disclosure, Mary Beth West and I spent actually a couple of years trying to pass ethics reforms within PRSA. What we wanted to add were fundamental things like due process and a formal grievance procedure, and really based upon ethical accountability so that there would be an equitable system to hold members and leaders alike accountable for their ethical conduct. We were not successful in that. Leadership opposed that, so we were not successful in that needed to be disclosed. One of our strongest advocates, however, in that effort was Dave Bicofsky, who is in New York, and he is a former member of the National PRSA Board. He is a former member of the PRSA Board of Ethics and Professional Standards, but most importantly, he has a long history of global communications and public relations work. And I'd like to ask him to speak about his experience, his takeaways, specifically overlaying ethics on top of his work settings.
Well, thank you, Susan, and hello, everyone. Ethics in public relations, an oxymoron? That's how I began to talk about ethics 20 years ago. Now, lots of things have changed in our profession and the world, especially the past year since then. But if you poll media gatekeepers today, I'll bet a large plurality, if not a majority, would reply yes to the oxymoronic question. As Susan mentioned, I was a member of PRSA's Board of Ethics and Professional Standards that changed the code of ethics from one of supposed enforcement to one that was and is aspirational. I strongly believe then and now that a code without enforcement is a toothless tiger, a corollary from my corporate days of if it ain't worth measuring, it ain't worth doing. Without an enforceable code on this side of the pond, can we truly be considered a profession no less than law, medicine, or engineering? Will the day come that licensure will be necessary to ensure that we are more than just a bag full of tactics? Ethical practice overlays and underpins all that we do in public relations, or it should be, and it must be. It begins and ends with honest, timely communications. The talk about licensing has been going on kind of in the background of the United States for many years. And unlike many countries, we have a national government, but it cedes many functions to the states. And as some of you may have seen, how we have the arguments in this country about how we should be responding to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Some states will do A, other states will do B, and the national government pretty well leaves it to the states. So licensing, if it comes in the United States, it'll be interesting to see how this occurs. Because right now, licensing for medicine, for law, for engineering, for many, many professional functions is handled on the state level. Now, we're living in a very, very changed world, and we will be until 2021, 2022, perhaps longer than that. And as you can see on the slide, so many of these shocks, both economic and clinical and psychological and social, might occur 4 years beyond that. So many of us, whether we're on the corporate side or so many on the agency side, or whether those are home-based or worldwide organizations, look at the changes that we've had to go through in terms of serving clients and serving ourselves. And the conundrum that we're facing in fighting this pandemic is multifold. How do we do this on a global level? But then how do we do it on the local level? From coming up with vaccines to ensuring that folks who've lost their jobs or had pretty low paying jobs to begin with, who've also lost theirs, how do they keep themselves and their families fed? Just recently, I saw something on the news that pretty well brought my wife and me to tears, watching a woman who was arrested for stealing $25 worth of food. She has 2 children. She had never been in trouble with the law before, and they hadn't eaten in 2 days. This is something that we as a society are going to be facing, and we're going to be facing. And as public relations practitioners, we can be in the vanguard in helping to find solutions, again, locally and globally. When it comes to layoffs, how do we operate as a profession when we're losing so much of our income? And I think this is something particularly that practitioners on the agency side are feeling more and more than on the corporate side. Because speaking to many of my corporate friends, they still have the jobs, they're still operating from home, whether in sweatshirts or putting on a shirt and sweater like this. And Lord knows what they might be wearing below the waist. I, by the way, have pants on, disclosure. This is just a problem that is not going to be ending this year, next year, or the year to come. When you look at the question of ethics, and Susan, I think, defined it well. Defining ethics, there are as many definitions as there are public relations, or how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It's kind of do the right thing. But what is the right thing? I just saw a few days ago in the Wall Street Journal that a country in Europe has passed a law that beginning 2 years from now, an agency or an individual can no longer deduct corporate bribes from their tax returns. Now, in the United States, giving a bribe is illegal, even if you're doing it overseas. So how do practitioners compete if agency A is allowed to bribe, but agency B by law is not? Now it's a question of law versus ethics. And this is something that's going to have to be discussed a lot more as we're increasingly a global society. What do we tell our clients? If a client says, I want you to get me that job, and I don't care how you do it. If you have to bribe, if you have to blackmail, I want you to do it. What do? Do you take the account? You resign the account. How do you stand up to a client and try to reach a balance that's legal and ethical? When we tell the truth, what is the truth? Mm-hmm. Is there complete truth? Is your truth my truth? Is truth opinion or is opinion truth? These at some point might have been very philosophical discussions in the ivory halls of academia. Right now, I think they're very, very real world. To sum up, ethics is overlaying and underpinning everything that we do, that we must do. I'm going to throw it back to you now.
Thank you so much, Dave. There were a lot of nuggets of wisdom in your talking points. I greatly appreciate that. I think one of the key points that we can all agree on, it doesn't really matter what your version of right or wrong is, but the fact is that it is your version. Ethics is personal. It starts within that individual. Being the kind of, I guess, geek that I am, I find pleasure in reading scientific and philosophical books. And we do have several recommended links at the end of this program about, are we born inherently ethical, inherently virtuous, inherently moral? Those are all kinds of things that can be debated ad nauseum, but the reality is, at the end of the day, is Dave's version of an ethical response the same as my version of an ethical response. And that is largely based on our personal ethical foundation, and then, of course, staying true north to what we believe. Let me pose just a few sort of elemental questions to the panelists and to participants. Ethics can be as minor, if you will, as, are you trying to game the online system? Are you submitting 2 or 3 different emails to an online retailer so that you can get more discounts on a product or service? Are you trying to purchase tickets to an event online, and your kids really are older than teenagers, but you're going to, submit that teenager rate? They're not going to check IDs because you're going to submit the teenager box and rate so you can get a cheaper ticket. I mean, it can be as remedial and behavioral as, are you going to return the grocery cart in the parking lot to its designated space? Is that a sign of your ethical demeanor? Is that a sign of your character? Ethics scandals have run rampant in 2020. In fact, I read the other day that 2020 is actually called the fib culture. Not really a moniker that we are proud of, but ethics can be very personal, in the sense of, there was a professional sports player diagnosed with COVID who thought it was a good idea after a game to go and hang out with fans and take pictures, knowing that he was diagnosed with COVID. That's an ethical call. It's also a personal call. It's not necessarily a regulated call, which goes back to Dave's comments about, as long as we have in this country, in the United States, as long as we have an aspirational only code of conduct and code of ethics, we're going to be talking about the possibility of regulation, oversight, and licensing of the public relations profession until the end of time. If you've ever participated or been on any webinars or panelist member, whatever, in the past probably 5 years, everything spirals down to, well, what can we do about the professional public relations industry in this country specifically? And it always comes down to, well, there's no teeth in the code of ethics. Anybody can hang a shingle out and say they are in PR, and they can be ethical or unethical. It's really a roll of the dice. But the fact is that there's no consistency and there's no enforceability. So that's where we are. On that note, I would like to bring in Sabrina. Sabrina, I believe, is based outside of DC. She has many years of experience, and I wanted to get her take on any non-negotiable ethics that one might have. Do we each have something within us that says, okay, honesty is the best policy? You will never not be honest. But is that the best policy? This goes back to, there's truth telling and there's ethics. Sabrina, from your perspective, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, yeah. So just to give a little background on myself, I have a little over 15 years of experience in-house and agency for PR. I've worked in pretty much every sector that you can think of, tech, pharma, lobbying and politics, to education. So runs the gamut. And, I think we all know that ethics and morals runs across different fields, no matter how safe you might think it is. So when I think about non-negotiable ethics, something I want to point out that is that as communicators, we have a lot of responsibility on our shoulders. Mental health issues in our field can attest to that. We're constantly making stressful decisions and we have to weigh those out. So when we think about the power that we hold, it needs to be taken seriously because it can have repercussions. And I think that we don't often think about the worst case scenario of our repercussions. So Susan, you brought up some good examples about, those are personal choices that you can make that might not necessarily extend to other people around you. But then you have the worst case scenarios like the athlete who, decided to go out, hang out with other people despite knowing they had COVID, right? And so when you think about what we do for a living, an example I can give about worst case scenarios, when I think of, pharmaceuticals, what if you find out that they're hiding symptoms and they're asking you, you know what, let's not really promote that. As a PR professional, you have to ask yourself, is that okay? What are the repercussions? Can I live with this decision? And that's even more timely in 2020 when we think of COVID-19 and that there is going, hopefully, fingers crossed, going to be a vaccine within the next year. And, at least in America, the entity responsible for communicating that would be, the federal communications teams, right? But they have been caught contradicting their own health agencies. And when you erode that trust, you have to ask yourself, are they going to believe you now? Do you deserve for them to trust you? And then how do you repair that damage? So I think that we can all agree that obviously if it's illegal, don't do it. That should be the easy choice, right? There's accountability there, which kind of ensures that you would hope someone would take that into consideration. But then there's also personal ethics. And personal ethics don't just affect you, but it can contribute to a company culture, whether you are in-house or at an agency. And it really, there's even differences within that model, right? If you, let's say you own your own agency, then obviously you get to set that culture of ethics and morals within your base, right? And you get to filter that down to your staff. But what do you do if you're a leader in someone else's agency? What do you do if you're a leader in an in-house company, right? How do you set that tone? And to be clear, it does start with leadership teams, right? If you exhibit that behavior, it sets as a role model, and then it'll filter down to the staff. It'll hold them accountable. You are saying, look, I see it, I'm going to model it, and I'm also going to hold you guys to that same bar. One of the issues that I always like to point out that when we talk about morals and ethics, there's a difference between leadership and day-to-day staff, right? There are far more consequences on the day-to-day staff than there are in leadership. Is simply just from the mechanics of organizational structure, right? Let's say a junior level account executive decides to stand up and say, this isn't okay, this isn't right, I don't want to do this. There could be the repercussion that the leadership decides, you know what, then you're not part of the team anymore, we're letting you go. And then you can break it down in terms of diversity, right? Those repercussions get a little bit higher when you are a person of color, when you are a woman in a male-dominated industry, and then it's harder to bounce back to get another job that has already deemed you as someone that isn't willing to cross that ethical or moral boundary. So if we collectively come together and say, look, this is the standard, and even though there isn't a license to practice PR, or there might not necessarily be a legal reason as to why we can't do what we do, we need to make sure that we're setting that bar from the top down and holding other people accountable within our own industry, right? So it's not just saying, look, my company's great. If there's another company not acting right or another PR person not acting right, it's important to call that out, hold it accountable, and expect better behavior.
Absolutely, absolutely. And your points about trust, and yes, absolutely, trust and respect, all of those things need to be earned. I've often said when meeting someone in a contentious situation or representing a controversial cause or candidate, someone will say, you just have to trust me. And I'm like, I will trust you until you give me a reason not to. And usually that reason is because we have had a difference of ethical responses to a situation. And I know that Sabrina has, I'm sure that some of you also have worked in public policy situations. That's an entirely different animal in terms of acceptable behaviors or things that I always think like, oh gosh, what would my parents do if they saw this? Or how would they feel if I made this decision? Would they be embarrassed or not? I want to go back to Rod for a second because we've been talking about enforceability and accountability, or lack thereof. And Rod, I'd like to ask you, what are your thoughts on what organizations can do to ensure that their codes of conduct are followed?
Absolutely. Well, I'll start. They say that good PR is a few simple messages repeated often. So I'm going to do that with a point I made earlier, which is that view anything on paper, on a website, any charters, any codes, as a starting point, not an end in themselves. I can't stress that strongly enough. Secondly, I think organizations need to think to that point about how they embed the charter and the codes in how they operate as individual organizations, including potentially translating them into things like employee contracts and into company policies, because otherwise they float around in the ether and simply aren't embedded culturally or structurally in the organization. Even that isn't enough, because then there's an act of education, of educating teams at all stages. And by that, I mean, from the very early days of a new starter induction, is that ethics should be involved and discussed in everything that a new starter, a new joiner to an organization sees and hears about the organization. And that then they're included in ethics refreshers. Because again, the fact that you've done the induction pack and included ethics doesn't mean that people will automatically remember. The education process has to be a constant one that's regularly refreshed. And then finally, and this isn't so much a sort of practical thing, it's an attitudinal one, is that I think both organizations and individual practitioners need to strike a balance between what I call the selfish and the selfless. There is a view that says, okay, we need to follow the law, obviously, as Sabrina says. We need to follow ethics because it's the right thing to do, but we're mainly doing it for reasons of self-protection, so that we don't get caught up in scandals, that we are seen by potential purchasers to be on the right side of these debates, and therefore we get on short lists. And therefore, for our business success, our revenue and our profits, it's the right thing to do. And I'm fine with that. That's all good. But I'd like to think that organizations and individual practitioners have one eye on the industry that we're all part of. And I know I will go to my professional grave hearing people going, public relations leads a public relations campaign, and it's all very boring, but sadly it's true. And I think that this is a great example where unless and until agencies, corporations and individual practitioners realize that their behavior goes to the heart of how the industry is perceived, unless they realize that they have to be selfless as part of an industry as well as selfish, then they will be falling short of their own obligations to themselves and to the industry. And I think that we're already seeing a lot of agencies, certainly in the UK, who are taking really bold stances on issues like diversity, inclusion, climate change. There's been a slew of organizations who are trying to get B Corp status, which says we don't just do ethics as a defensive play, we do ethics as a badge of honor, we do ethics as a fundamental statement of our purpose. So as I say, it's got to be not just the starting point, embedded in what you do, inducted, trained regularly, but also this notion of balancing the selfish with the selfless, your self-interest align with the industry's interest.
Yes, absolutely. Well said. Very, very well said. I've often said I don't have any scientific data to back this up, but it seems a logical conclusion that if an organization, as well in the leadership, if everything is being operated on a strong ethical foundation of doing the right thing, again, going back to the golden rule, then the issues of diversity and transparency and all of those things, and this may be naive on my part, but it just seems like all of those things would fall into place. If you have you know, the best interest of your clients or your members or staff or whatever, if those best interests are truly at heart, you've got a strong ethical foundation. And so you're going to want to have diverse representation on a project or on your payroll or whatever. It seems to me that's where we go back to the staying true north to your ethical compass. If your ethical compass is wishy-washy, if it's a pendulum, there's a problem. With that, saying that, I would also say that there aren't necessarily any clear-cut rights or wrongs in today's world. We have a lot of ambiguity. You know, one industry may find X, Y, and Z behavior unacceptable, and another industry may say, well, that's just the norm here. That's not even considering cultural or geographic issues. So we have to have that strong ethical foundation. And to me, that to me would certainly go towards solving so many of the other issues that plague our profession. I'm also thinking that when Rod was talking, gosh, we really need a rallying cry to do something in the North Americas. We need a rallying cry to improve our ratings, certainly with the recent ECO report. And then there are other more academic studies that show the integrity rankings of public relations as a professional choice by students, that those integrity rankings are consistently on a downward decline. We need to do something about that. I'm going to turn it back over to Dave, and then I'd like to ask Sabrina to chime in on, you know, gosh, what can we do in this country to stop talking about licensing and regulation and start talking about how can we make our public relations profession more accountable and more respectable?
Thank you, Susan. When I joined PRSA in 1975, yes, before the Great Flood, the great rallying cry that I was hearing was public relations must earn its rightful place in the C-suite. Well, 45 years later, we're hearing the same thing. And we're going to keep hearing it unless we do a couple of things. One, ethics, whether on the agency side or the corporate side or the nonprofit side or government or educational institutions, ethics must be taught and practiced constantly, no less than we teach earnings per share and return on investment. I think back to my days as an underpaid daily newspaper copy editor, and I hated cliches, but I want to give you two right now. One is the shadow of the leader, and that really, really defines an organization. If the top of the house, the CEO, the chairman, if she or he practices what they preach, it will cascade down the organizations. If it's lip service, it will not. I think of another cliche that is taught to every officer candidate in the United States Armed Forces when they're going through their OTS training. Follow me over the hill. You must lead. If it's you folks go ahead, I'll catch up with you later, it's doomed to failure. And the last thing I'd like to do is paraphrase a biblical passage. Okay. If not ethical practice, then what? If not now, when? Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Dave. Sabrina, any comments you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. So, you know, like Dave said, it starts with exhibiting moral and ethical behavior, and at the top, it starts with leadership, right? Setting that role model standard and holding your staff accountable. But as an individual, you know, I want to point out it's tough, but you have to not be afraid of making those tough decisions. And if I can give examples, you know, because I want people to understand that you're not alone, that we've all on this panel, I'm sure everyone tuning in has been in this situation. And two particular examples come to mind for me where, you know, I once worked for a lobbying firm and they had a client that wanted to actively fight against fresh groceries in low income areas. And I knew they chose me because I was the only minority on staff. And it made it look from an optics standpoint a little bit better when I was doing it. I was lucky. I worked for a great company that completely understood when I said, look, this is never going to happen. I'm not going to do it and you shouldn't either. And they had a tough discussion. And since it was a lobbying company, it was primarily lawyers. So you can imagine how fun that is. But they were great. They sat there and said, look, you're right. This might be legal, but it's not moral and ethical. And this is something that we've decided this is not a good fit for us. I had other examples from agency. You know, I run my own consulting agency, and we had put together a marketing deck for a company, a lifestyle company. And in the middle of the presentation, they stopped and said, why are there so many Black people in the ads? And, you know, and I sat there and said, well, over 90% of your customers are Black. And they responded with, well, we don't want our brand associated with that. And it took me a minute to, you know, be calm. But I sat there and said, look, then I don't want to be associated with you. This isn't a good fit and we need to part ways. Yeah, that was a loss of business, but please know I sleep better at night. I can live with my actions. And that's something that you have to ask yourself. What can you live with? Susan talks about her parents and how they would feel if they knew you did something. I think in PR, at some point, we're always taught in education, you know, what if your words or actions were on the cover of the New York Times? Would you be embarrassed? Would you be proud? And we always constantly have to put and frame our conversations and our actions in that lens. And I think that will help guide us. And then the other thing I just want to sit there and say, you know, Susan, you pointed out the year of the fib, right? Look, this is a much larger problem, not just in our industry, but as individuals. You know, this starts with being a parent and teaching it to your kids, being an educator and teaching it in schools. And this is going to be something, like Rod said, it's going to be constant, it's going to be involving, and our work is never going to be done in this area. But if we collectively come at it from whether it's a PR person, a PR agency, you know, the head of PR at a company or a parent, educator, we can start to make that change. There is no point in history where we've ever said, you know what, we went too far. That's it. There's no coming back from this, right? Like, it's never too late. So the call to action, you know, is just start now. Start now and hold everyone around you accountable and work with them to create that better environment.
Great. Thank you so much, Sabrina. That is an excellent segue to, I don't know if Izzy's going to mention this, but that is an excellent segue to the PRCA's Ethics Ambassador Program. Izzy, is this something that you could address, or would you like me to speak to that?
No, that's fine. I can go ahead with that. So the PRCA Ethics Ambassador Quiz will be sent round this afternoon. This is your opportunity to become an Ethics Ambassador for the year 2020 to 2021. You'll get a special logo that you can use on all of your online communications. And it really just does show that you're up to date with your understanding of ethics, and that really you understand ethics in the here and now, because it's not only fundamental to who we are as individuals, but as the panelists have shared, fundamental to the industry and the profession as a whole. So very exciting opportunity for everyone. And yeah, that's it.
Great. I would like to add on the quiz. In our prior discussions to planning this event, it is important to note that this group of panelists and PRCA, we are far past the if you get a coffee mug, should you tell anyone about it kind of ethics questions. We are past those kinds of elemental and remedial questions. So this quiz, while it does have some yes or no questions regarding the specific standards and codes of PRCA, it also has some open-ended question scenarios, not necessarily rights or wrongs, but these are hopefully thought-provoking questions that in 2020 and post-COVID world, public relations practitioners, agency owners, corporate staff, whatever, you're going to be dealing with. And again, this is to get you back to your true north of your ethical compass. Izzy, do we have any questions, or does anyone have any questions or comments they would like to add before we close? And we're doing very, very well on time, so we do have a few more minutes.
We don't have any questions at the moment, but do feel free to send them in. I know from my standpoint, actually, if I could proffer a question, I hope that's not selfish of me. But
ask Rod.
Thank you. But Rod, when you were talking about the code as a whole within PRCA, I was just wondering how the code actually began to come about, and what were the sort of the fire starters, if you will, that encouraged the code to be developed?
Yeah, I'm pleased to say that although I'm old, I'm not necessarily old enough to know what the original Spark was, because both the charter and the codes predated me, I'm relieved to say. I suppose to try and not be entirely unhelpful, on the public affairs side, I think the sense was that because public affairs practice was evolving so quickly that it needed to be refreshed. And I know that the Public Affairs Board in the UK, following the merger with the APPC, did a consultation and has been refreshing the code, again, to reflect the way in which practice happens at the moment. But yeah, as I say, unhelpfully, I wasn't there when the ARC was launched, unfortunately. So can't help you there. Apologies.
Any other questions or comments from Izzy or any other participants? Otherwise, Izzy will leave you with some recommended links of some articles, some codes of conduct that might be helpful to you as well. And I understand this has been recorded and snippets of this will be promoted. Is that an accurate statement, Izzy?
Yeah, that's correct. So all of this will be uploaded onto the PRCA's YouTube channel. If you just type in PRCA into YouTube, we will come up, I think, potentially underneath our friends, the Rodeo Cowboys, if you type it in from North America. But you will eventually find our channel and you'll find this segment on there.